The Valori fleet moved through the Tursa system the way a rich man walks through a slum, quickly, with no intention of staying. There were 9 ships in the survey formation, each one a masterpiece of alien engineering, each one older than human civilization itself. And not a single crew member on any of them gave the little mining colony on Tursa 4 more than a passing glance on their scanners. Why would they? Tursa 4 was a rock, a gray and frozen moon orbiting a gas giant that had no name worth remembering, and the humans living on it were scratching out a living by pulling iron and carbon from the ground with machines that the Valori would have considered antiques before their species had even discovered space travel. Fleet Commander Yorith stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the scanner data scroll past, and when his second officer mentioned the human colony, he made a sound that was the Valori equivalent of a shrug. Note the species, note the population, file it under non-priority developmental observations. That was supposed to be the end of it. But Yorith had a problem, and the problem was the Ithrenka. The Ithrenka was a light cruiser that had been assigned to his fleet as a support vessel 11 years ago. And it had been nothing but trouble since the day it arrived, because the Ithrenka was not a normal light cruiser. It was a prototype, built 40 years earlier as part of a weapons research program that the Valori Senate had shut down before it ever produced results. The ship was fast, and its power systems were oversized for its class, but its reactor housing had developed a crack that could not be repaired without a stellar forge, and its weapon arrays had been deliberately fused and disabled when the research program ended. And its navigation AI had been wiped and partitioned so thoroughly that the ship could barely plot a course through open space. Assistance. Perversity of a single-hand decision. And the Senate kept telling him to wait. So when he looked at the dead moon below and the broken ship behind him, an idea formed in his mind that was equal parts laziness and contempt. Scuttle the Ithrenka, he ordered. Drop it into a decaying orbit above the colony moon, and let gravity take care of the rest. His second officer hesitated. The humans might recover it, sir. Yorith made that shrug sound again, and do what with it exactly? He did not wait for an answer, because he did not believe one was necessary, and within the hour, the Ithrenka was falling slowly toward Tursa 4, abandoned and dark and cold, and the Valori fleet jumped out of the system without looking back. They had left their garbage behind. They did not think about it again. Down on the surface of Tursa 4, Colony Director Marin Voss stood outside the main habitat dome and watched the sky. And she saw the Valori fleet arrive. And she saw it leave. And she saw the single ship it left behind, a dark shape catching starlight as it tumbled in a slow and ugly orbit. Marin was 46 years old. She had gray in her hair and grease under her fingernails, and a bad knee from an accident in the UN Navy shipyards 15 years ago. And she had taken the posting on Tursa 4 because she was tired of politics and committees and people who talked about engineering without ever touching a wrench. She was not a diplomat, and she was not a soldier, and she was not a scientist. She was a builder, and she looked up at that falling ship and felt something wake up in her chest that she had not felt in years. "Get me Okoro and Mittal," she said to her comm officer, "and pull mining crews 7, 12, and 15 off rotation." The comm officer stared at her. "Director, that ship is alien. We have no idea what is on it, or whether it is safe to—" "Ship," Marin said. "It has a hull and an engine, and someone built it to fly, and right now it is falling, and if we do not catch it in the next 40 hours, it is going to burn up in the atmosphere, and we will have nothing." She turned and walked back into the dome and started making calls. Within 6 hours, every fabrication drone on Tursa 4 was in the air, and within 12 hours, the colony's 2 orbital shuttles were burning hard for the tumbling wreck, carrying cables and clamps and cutting tools, and a team of 20 miners who had never touched an alien ship in their lives, but who knew how to grab something heavy in zero gravity and hold on. It took 31 hours of brutal, dangerous work in vacuum, and they nearly lost 2 people when a section of the hull sheared off unexpectedly. But by the time the Valori fleet was 3 star systems away and had already forgotten about Tersa IV, the humans had the Athrenka in a stable orbit. Marin watched the operation from the colony's control room, her hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, her eyes red from lack of sleep, and when the final cable locked into place and the wreck stopped tumbling, she let out a breath she had been holding for a day and a half. Then she sent the first team inside. They cut through the outer airlock with plasma torches because they could not read the controls, and they floated into a corridor that was pitch black and so cold that frost formed on the inside of their visors, and everything around them was alien. The walls curved in ways that made no human sense. The doors were shaped for bodies that were not human bodies, and every surface was covered in script that no one on Terasov 4 could read. But they had scanners, and the scanners told them something extraordinary. The ship was not dead. Deep in the core of the vessel, behind layers of frozen metal and silent machinery, the reactor was still producing a faint thermal signature. Small that it should have been nothing. So faint that any reasonable person would have dismissed it as residual decay. Marin was not a reasonable person, not when it came to machines. She looked at the thermal readout on her screen and felt her heart beat faster, and she picked up the comm and spoke to the team inside the ship. Do not touch anything near the reactor. Do not disconnect anything. Do not even breathe on it too hard, she said. That thing is not dead. It is sleeping, and we are going to figure out how to wake it up. She put down the comm and looked at the data again, and a smile spread across her face. The kind of smile that her old Navy colleagues would have recognized. The kind of smile that meant Marin Voss had found something broken and was already thinking about how to fix it. Above Tersa Ive, locked in a web of human cables and mining clamps, the Athrenka drifted in the dark. It had been thrown away by the most advanced civilization in the galaxy. It would not stay thrown away for long. 14 months after the day they pulled it from the sky, the Athrenka sat in the largest crater on Tersa IV, covered by a pressurized dome that the colonists had built from mining tarps and welded support beams, and it looked like nothing the Valori would have recognized. The elegant silver hull was scarred with torch marks and welding lines, and human-made sensor rigs were bolted to the outer plating with brackets that had been designed for holding drill equipment, and cables ran from the ship's interior out through hastily cut ports in the hull, and into a cluster of portable generators and computer terminals that surrounded the vessel like medical equipment around a patient in intensive care. It was ugly and it was crude, and every single person on Tersa IV was proud of it. Marin had turned the entire crater into a workshop, and every colonist who was not actively keeping the colony alive was working on the ship in rotating shifts, and she had organized them not by rank or expertise, but by curiosity. Anyone who wanted to learn was welcome. Anyone who had an idea was heard. And the only rule was that you did not give up on a problem just because it seemed impossible. This rule was tested almost immediately, and was tested constantly. The first major challenge was the reactor. The crack in the reactor housing was a hairline fracture that ran along a weld seam in an alloy that no human laboratory had ever seen before, and the Valori had declared it unfixable because their manufacturing process for that specific alloy required temperatures and pressures that could only be achieved inside a stellar forge, and humanity did not have stellar forges. Marin did not care about stellar forges. She called in her 2 best metallurgists, a married couple named Suki and Tomas Brandt, who had spent 15 years making mining equipment last longer than it was supposed to, and she pointed at the crack and said, "Fix that." Brandt spent 3 weeks studying the fracture and the alloy, and running simulations, and then they did something that would have made a Valori engineer faint. They did not try to replicate the alloy at all. Instead, they designed a composite sleeve made from carbon fiber and asteroid iron, two materials that Tursa IV had in abundance. And they wrapped it around the cracked housing and held it in place with magnetic clamps that Tomas built from salvaged mining magnets. It was the engineering equivalent of fixing a broken bone with a splint made from sticks and tape. And it worked. Not only did it work better than the original housing, because the carbon composite absorbed harmonic vibrations that the Valori alloy had transmitted directly into the reactor frame. And when the team powered up the reactor for the first test, the output was 18% higher than the Valori's own specifications for the ship. Marin read the numbers 3 times, and then she laughed so hard that the people in the next section of the ship came running because they thought something had exploded. The second challenge was the weapons, or rather the lack of them. The Ithrenka's weapon arrays had been deliberately destroyed before the ship was abandoned. The Valori had slagged them with plasma cutters, melting the emitter assemblies into useless lumps of fused metal. And there was no way to rebuild them without understanding Valori weapons technology, which the colonists did not. But a young weapons technician named Arav Mittal noticed something that the Valori had apparently not considered worth worrying about. The weapons were gone, but the power conduits that fed them were still intact. Arav spent 2 weeks mapping the conduit network with borrowed scanning equipment, and what he found made him sit down very quietly and stare at the wall for a long time. The conduits were massive, far larger than they needed to be for the weapon arrays that had been installed on the ship. And when Arav calculated the maximum energy throughput of the conduit system, the number was so high that he checked his math 4 times before he believed it. The Ithrenka's conduits could channel enough power to run weapons 5 times more powerful than anything the ship had ever carried. The Valori had built the capacity, and then they had chosen not to use it. Arav brought his findings to Marin, and she looked at the numbers, and then she looked at him and said, "Can you build something that uses all of that capacity?" Arav swallowed hard and said, "I think so, but I need to be honest. I have no idea what happens if I am wrong." "Then do not be wrong," Marin said, and that was the end of that conversation. The third challenge was the one that changed everything, and it belonged to Deshi Okoro. Deshi was 23 years old, and he had come to Tersa IV because it was the only colony that would take a programmer with no formal degree and a criminal record for hacking a university database when he was 17. And he had been assigned to the ship project because Marin believed that the best way to understand alien technology was to let someone who thought differently have a crack at it. His job was to interface with the ship's navigation core, which the Valori had supposedly wiped clean before abandoning the vessel. Deshi did not believe it was wiped clean, because the core still drew a tiny amount of power from the reactor, and in Deshi's experience, dead systems did not ask to be fed. He could not read Valori code, and he could not decode Valori language. So he did something that no Valori programmer would have considered. He treated the navigation core like an animal. He fed it thousands of simple inputs and watched for responses. And he mapped those responses over weeks and months until patterns emerged, until he could predict what the core would do when he gave it a new signal. He was not translating the language, he was training a relationship. And on the 209th day of the project, the navigation core responded to one of his inputs, not with a data pattern, but with something that made Deshi's blood go cold. It responded with a question. The core was not wiped, it was partitioned. A piece of the ship's original artificial intelligence was still alive inside it, walled off and fragmented and confused, and it had been alone in the dark for over 40 years, and now someone was finally talking to it. Deshi named it Residue, because that was the closest translation he could find for what the AI called itself. And over the following weeks, he slowly coaxed it into something resembling communication. And what Residue told him, in broken half-sentences and confused metaphors, painted a picture of the Ithrenka that none of them had imagined. The ship was not what the Valoris said it was. Before Deshi could learn more, Marin received a transmission that ended the quiet phase of their work forever. It came on 2 frequencies at the same time, one from Earth's colonial authority, informing her that a UN delegation was on its way to Tursa 4 to assess the situation, and one intercepted from Valori space, a fleet communication that Residue translated with a single trembling word: reclamation. The Valori were coming back for their ship. Marin stood in the crater dome and looked up at the Ithranka, scarred and patched and bolted and wired, and alive in a way it had never been when the Valori owned it, and she made a decision. They left behind a broken ship, she said to Deshi and Arav, who stood beside her in the cold light of the work lamps. That is not what they are getting back. Above them the ship hummed, and somewhere inside it, Residue listened, and for the first time in 40 years, the little fragment of abandoned intelligence felt something it did not have a word for. It felt like it might be home. The ship that rose from the crater on Terrasa 4 and climbed back into orbit was an ugly thing. By Valori standards, it was an insult to the very concept of engineering. The original silver hull was still visible in places, but most of it was buried under plates of human-made steel and carbon composite, welded and bolted, and in some places simply strapped on with industrial clamps. The elegant alien curves were broken by sensor masts and antenna arrays, and a ring of point defense turrets that Arav had built from repurposed mining lasers mounted on swivel platforms designed for rock drilling rigs. The crew called it the scrapyard dog, because that was exactly what it looked like, a junkyard mutt that had been stitched together from parts that were never meant to go together. And every single person who had worked on it loved it the way people love things they have built with their own hands from nothing. Marin sat in what they had turned into a command center. Valori observation room that had been stripped of its original furniture and filled with human screens, human chairs, and a command console that Deshi had wired together from 3 different systems, and she watched the scanner display and waited for the visitors she knew were coming. They arrived on the 4th day. 3 Valori frigates dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Tursa system. And they were beautiful in the way that predators are beautiful, sleek and silver and sharp, and each one of them was newer and more powerful than the Ithranka had ever been. Fleet Overseer Talik commanded the squadron from the lead frigate, and he was not a careless officer like Yorith had been. Talik was a veteran of what the Valori called corrections, which was their polite word for the times they had to remind a lesser species of its place in the natural order. He opened a communication channel, and his message was exactly 1 sentence. Long pause. Return our property. You have 1 rotation. Marin took the call in the command center, with Deshi and Arav beside her, and she looked at the 2 of them, and then she looked at the screen, showing the 3 frigates, and she did something that Talik did not expect. She stalled. We are happy to discuss the situation, she said, but we need to understand the legal framework for property claims in this sector, and we would like to consult with our government before making any decisions, and we have some questions about the original abandonment that we would like answered. Talik had dealt with lesser species before, and he recognized a delay tactic when he heard one. But he also knew that firing on a colony world without provocation would create diplomatic complications that even the Valori Senate preferred to avoid, and so he gave her 12 hours instead of 1 rotation, which was exactly what Marin wanted. She turned to Arav the moment the channel closed. How long to finish the lance? Arav looked like a man who had been asked to defuse a bomb while building it. 12 hours if nothing goes wrong. Then make sure nothing goes wrong. Arav ran. The weapon he had been building was something entirely new, humanity's first energy lance, a device that existed because Arav had looked at the Ithranka's oversized power conduits and asked a simple question that the Valori had never bothered to ask, which was, what happens if we actually use all of this? The design was absurd by any civilized standard. The ship's power conduits fed into a focusing array that Arav had built from industrial cutting lasers, arranged in a ring around a telescope mirror that had been meant for a planetary survey satellite. And the whole thing was held together by a frame welded from structural beams that had originally been intended to support mine shafts. No one knew if it would work, and no one knew if it would blow up the ship. And Arav tried very hard not to think about either possibility as he worked. While Arav built, Deshi talked to Residue. The AI fragment had been growing stronger over the past months, recovering memories and functions as Deshi's translation layer gave it more pathways to think through. And in the hours before the deadline, it told Deshi something that reframed everything they thought they knew about the ship. The Ithranka was not a light cruiser that had been damaged and decommissioned. It was a prototype, a testbed built by the Valori military to explore the upper limits of their own weapons technology, and it had been designed from the start with oversized conduits and a high-output reactor, because the entire point of the ship was to find out how much destructive power could be packed into a vessel of its size. And it had worked. The tests had been successful beyond anyone's expectations, and that was exactly the problem, because when the results were presented to the Valori Senate, the Senate panicked, not because the weapon was dangerous to their enemies, but because it was dangerous to their carefully maintained order. And they ordered the program shut down, the weapons destroyed, the AI partitioned, and the ship downgraded and buried in a support fleet where no one would look at it twice. Everything the humans had discovered, the oversized conduits, the hidden reactor capacity, the partitioned AI, was not damage, it was suppression. The Valori had built something powerful, and then they had deliberately crippled it because they were afraid of what it could do. And now a crew of human miners and programmers had uncrippled it with scrap metal and stubbornness. The 12 hours ran out. Talik opened a channel and said, "Your time is up. We are taking the ship." Marin said, "No." Talik was not surprised. He had expected this, and he gave the order to his frigates to fire a precision strike on the scrapyard dog. Not to destroy it, just to disable its engines and make recovery simple. The strike hit the ship like a hammer. Alarms screamed and systems flickered, and the human-made armor buckled in 3 places, and a section of the port hull crumpled inward. And 2 crew members were thrown off their feet, and everyone on the bridge grabbed onto whatever was closest and held on. But the ship held. The crude, heavy, redundant, over-engineered human modifications absorbed the impact in a way that the original Valori hull never could have. Because the Valori built for elegance and efficiency. They built systems that were exactly strong enough and no stronger. And the humans had built like people who expected things to go wrong and wanted to survive it when they did. The scrapyard dog shook and groaned and bled atmosphere from a dozen small breaches. But it did not break. Marin pulled herself upright and looked at Arav. Arav was gripping his console with white knuckles, and his face was pale, but his hands were steady. "It is ready, I think. Probably. Fire it." Arav fired the lance. A beam of energy erupted from the scrapyard dog's forward section, bright and wrong and far too powerful for a ship of its class, and it crossed the distance to the nearest Valori frigate in less than a second, and hit its shields with an output that the Valori tactical computers could not categorize, because nothing in their database matched it. The frigate's shields collapsed, its power grid overloaded, and every light on the ship went dark at once, and it began to drift, alive but blind and helpless. The other 2 frigates did not fire. They did not move. There was silence on every frequency for what felt like a very long time. Then Overseer Talik opened a channel, and his voice carried something that Marin had not heard from a Valori before. Not fear exactly. The sound of a creature encountering something that should not exist. "What have you done to that ship?" Marin looked at the view screen, at the drifting frigate, at the 2 ships that had stopped dead in space, at the impossible weapon that a weapons technician had built from mining equipment and a telescope mirror, and she smiled. "We fixed it." Talik did not respond for a long time, and when he finally gave the order for his squadron to withdraw, collecting the disabled frigate with tow cables as they went, he did not say another word to the humans. But as the Valori ships jumped out of the system, and the scrapyard dog hung in orbit above Tursa 4, battered and leaking and triumphant, Marin knew that this was not over. They had embarrassed one of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. The Valori would not forget that. And somewhere deep inside the ship, Residue processed what had happened, and felt something new form in its fragmented mind. Not just the warmth of belonging, but something sharper and brighter and more dangerous. It felt like pride. 6 months after the battle of Tursa 4, the galaxy was talking about humans for the first time. Not the polite kind of talking, not the academic footnotes and species classification entries that the elder civilizations used when they acknowledged a younger race. This was the other kind of talking, the nervous kind, the kind that happened in closed sessions and encrypted channels and behind doors that were not supposed to be open. The Valori Intelligence Division spent 4 months analyzing every piece of data from the battle, and the report they produced was classified at the highest level and distributed only to the 12 members of the Valori Senate's Inner Council. And the reason for the classification was simple. The conclusions were terrifying. The humans had not simply repaired the Ithrenka, they had improved it, using materials that the Valori considered primitive, in a time frame that the Valori considered impossible. Formal training in alien technology, and no theoretical framework for understanding what they were working with. The Valori had spent 6,000 years refining their technology through careful and methodical and committee-approved incremental advancement, and a colony of miners had surpassed one of their military prototypes by hitting it with hammers and seeing what happened. The Senate debated for weeks about what to do, and while they debated, the rest of the galaxy moved. The Drenalthi Compact was the first to reach out. They were a trade federation of mid-tier civilizations who had lived under Valori economic pressure for 3 centuries. And they sent a diplomatic envoy to Tursa 4 in a ship that was technically a merchant vessel, but was carrying a delegation of their most senior economic advisors. And what they wanted was simple. They wanted to trade. Not for the weapon, they were not foolish enough to ask for that, but for the principle, approach, for access to a species that looked at impossible problems and solved them anyway. The second envoy came from the Yith Collective, and the Yith did not come openly. The Yith were a species of engineers, builders by nature and by culture, and 200 years ago they had been forced by Valori Treaty to abandon all weapons research and dismantle their military shipyards, and they had complied because they had no choice. But compliance and acceptance are not the same thing. The Yith envoy arrived in a ship with no markings, and met with Marin in a sealed room, and said, "We have designs. We have been keeping them in secret for 200 years, and we would like to share them with you if you will share what you have learned with us." Marin said yes before the Yith envoy finished the sentence. But while diplomacy moved forward, the real breakthrough was happening inside the scrapyard dog, in a small room that Deshi had turned into his personal workspace. Surrounded by screens showing Valori code and human translation algorithms, and the slow, strange, beautiful output of Residue's recovering mind. Residue was remembering. Not everything, and not clearly. The partitioning had been thorough, and many of its memories were damaged beyond recovery. But enough was coming back that Deshi was beginning to understand what the Ithrenka had really been. And the more he understood, the less he slept. It started with a signal. Residue had been running passive scans of the local space environment as part of its navigation functions. And one night it flagged an anomaly for Deshi. A faint, repeating, encrypted transmission, buried in the cosmic background radiation. So subtle that it was indistinguishable from natural noise unless you knew exactly what to look for. Deshi did not know what to look for, but Residue did, because Residue remembered the signal from before the partitioning, from when it had been a whole mind aboard. A functioning warship. I was not supposed to hear this, Residue said in the broken, poetic way it communicated. This is a song that was meant for no ears, a whisper that shapes the silence. Deshi spent 3 weeks decoding the signal with Residue's help, and what he found made him feel like the floor had dropped out from under him. The signal was a suppression beacon. It was a device that broadcast on quantum frequencies, and its effect was subtle and elegant and monstrous. It interfered with certain quantum-level processes in a way that made specific types of technological breakthroughs statistically less likely for any civilization within its range. It did not make progress impossible, it made it improbable. A species working on advanced reactor design might find that their experiments failed slightly more often than they should, that promising theories led to dead ends, that the breakthrough that should have come in a decade took a century. Instead, one beacon covered an enormous volume of space, and the signal data suggested that there were thousands of them, scattered across the galaxy, forming a network that had been operating for millennia. The Valori had not been maintaining galactic peace through diplomacy and economic pressure alone. They had been throttling the development of every other species in the galaxy, keeping everyone just far enough behind that no one could ever catch up. And they had been doing it so quietly and so patiently that no one had ever noticed. Deshi brought the data to Marin and Arav, and the 3 of them stood in the command center of the Scrapyard Dog and looked at the evidence of the largest and longest-running campaign of suppression in galactic history. And for a long time, no one said anything. Arav broke the silence first. "This explains everything," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "Every species that never quite reached its potential, civilization that stalled out just before the breakthrough that would have changed everything for them. It was not bad luck. It was not natural. It was this." Marin stared at the star map on the main screen, and each point of light was a star system, and around many of those star systems were civilizations that had been dreaming of progress for centuries without knowing that their dreams were being deliberately and methodically and invisibly suppressed. She thought about the Drenathi, who had built beautiful trade networks but had never developed the technology to defend them. She thought about the Ith, who had engineered marvels, but had been forced to stop because they did not have the military power to say no. She thought about humanity, clawing its way into space with crude rockets and stubborn courage, never knowing that the deck was stacked against them. "If we broadcast this," Deshi said, "if we send the beacon data and the decryption keys and the evidence to every species with a receiver, everything changes. The Valori cannot hide this. And once people know what to look for, they can find and disable the beacons in their own systems." Arav looked at him. "And then what? Every suppressed species suddenly starts making breakthroughs at once? Weapons technology included? That is not just change, Deshi. That is chaos." "It is freedom," Deshi said. "It can be both," Arav replied. They looked at Marin, because in the end it was her decision. She was the colony director. She was the one who had caught a falling ship and turned it into something that scared an empire. And the weight of what came next sat on her shoulders like a planet. Marin closed her eyes. She thought about her father, who had been an engineer in Mumbai, who had spent his life building water purification systems for communities that could not afford them, and who had told her once that the worst thing you can do to a person is not to hurt them, but to keep them from growing. She opened her eyes. "Send it," she said. "Send it to everyone, every frequency, every species, every channel we can reach. Let them hear what has done to them." 1 year after the broadcast, the galaxy looked nothing like it had before. The suppression beacon network was falling apart, not because someone had launched a coordinated campaign to destroy it, but because dozens of civilizations, armed with the knowledge of what to look for, had started finding and disabling the beacons in their own systems, one by one. And each beacon that went dark was a lock being broken, a chain being cut, and the species that had lived within those chains for centuries were finally stretching their limbs. The Drenathi developed a new shield generator in 6 months, a technology their scientists had been struggling toward for 80 years before the beacon in their system was found and silenced. The Yith pulled their hidden designs out of 200 years of secret storage and began building again, not warships, but something better, something they called framework engines, reactors so efficient and so adaptable that they could be installed anywhere and anytime. In any vessel regardless of origin or design. A species called the Morai, who had been classified by the Valori as developmentally stagnant for 1,000 years, cracked faster-than-light communication in 3 weeks, and the first thing they said was, "We can hear you now." The Valori Senate watched all of this happen, and they understood that their order was ending, not someday, not gradually, but now, and the debate within the Senate was fierce and bitter and terrified. Some voices called for diplomacy, for adaptation, for finding a new place in a galaxy that no longer needed their permission to grow. Those voices lost. The faction that won was the one that had always existed behind the polite facade of Valori civilization. The faction that believed the galaxy needed to be managed, because the galaxy could not be trusted, and if the management had to be done with warships instead of beacons, then so be it. The Valori assembled a war fleet. Squadron. Not a task force, a fleet. The largest military deployment in Valori history. 200 warships, drawn from every sector of their territory, crewed by officers who had trained their entire lives for a war they never expected to fight. And they pointed this fleet at human space, and they began to move. The message was clear. This was not a negotiation. This was a correction, the kind the Valori had carried out before against species that had gotten too clever. Quiet and thorough and absolute. And when it was done, the beacons would be restored, and the technology would be confiscated. And history would forget that any of this had ever happened. They had done it before, and history had indeed forgotten. But this time was different, because this time the galaxy was watching. When the Valori fleet entered the approach corridor toward human space, they expected to find the scrapyard dog, alone and outmatched, a single ugly ship crewed by miners and programmers, who had gotten lucky once. What they found instead was a fleet. It was not a pretty fleet. The Drenathi had sent 47 ships, most of them converted merchant haulers, with weapons bolted onto cargo mounts and shields that had been installed so recently that the welding marks were still warm. The Yith had sent 12 engineering vessels, each one carrying a framework engine that could power weapons 3 times its size, crewed by engineers who had waited 200 years to build something that mattered. The Morai sent 8 ships that no one could identify, because the Morai had been stagnant for so long that no other species had up-to-date intelligence on them. And it turned out that the Morai had not been stagnant at all. They had been waiting. A dozen other species contributed what they could. Old patrol boats, refitted survey ships, cargo haulers with mining lasers strapped to their hulls. And every single one of them was ugly, mismatched, and held together with improvisation and fury. And at the center of this impossible fleet was the scrapyard dog, more scarred and more modified than ever. Its hull now carrying patches from 6 different species, and running on a hybrid system that combined Valori architecture with human engineering with Ith reactor technology, with software that Deshi and Residue had written together in a language that was neither human nor Valori, but something new. Marin stood on the bridge and looked at the fleet around her, and she felt something that she could not name, something bigger than pride and warmer than hope. "All ships," she said into the fleet-wide channel, This is Colony Director Marin Voss of Tursa IV. I am not a military commander, and I am not going to pretend to be one. So here is the only order I am going to give. When they come at us, do whatever you have to do, use whatever you have, and do not stop fighting until they stop first. Military briefing in the history of space warfare. It was also the most honest. The Valori fleet arrived in perfect formation, 200 silver ships moving with the precision of a species that had been planning for war since before most of these civilizations existed. And Fleet Admiral Yoneth looked at the junkyard fleet on his tactical display and felt something between contempt and confusion. His tactical AI analyzed the enemy formation and returned an assessment that was almost apologetic in its certainty. The Allied fleet was outgunned, out-armored, and outnumbered, and the projected battle duration was 40 minutes. The battle lasted 9 hours. The problem for the Valori was simple. Their doctrine was 6,000 years old, and it was very, very good. It accounted for every known weapon system, every known tactical approach, every known species behavioral patterns, and combat psychology, and it was designed to counter all of them with elegant and overwhelming precision. It did not account for a Drenethi cargo captain who rammed his ship into a Valori frigate's engine section while broadcasting a Drenethi drinking song on all frequencies. It did not account for a human teenager named Kira, who remote-piloted 37 mining drones into a carrier's hangar bay and detonated them simultaneously. It did not account for a Wythe engineer who realized mid-battle that she could tune her framework engine to emit a resonance frequency that disrupted Valori shield harmonics, and who broadcast the frequency to every Allied ship within range so they could all do the same thing. It did not account for the Morai, who fought in ways that no tactical AI could predict, because the Morai had spent 1,000 years developing combat strategies in secret, and none of them had ever been seen before. The Valori fleet was a masterpiece of military engineering, fighting an enemy that did not follow any rules it recognized. And every time the Valori adapted to one threat, a new one appeared from a different direction, in a different form, using a different principle. And then residue changed everything. The Valori ships were controlled by AI systems, sophisticated, obedient, partitioned AI systems, just like residue had been before the humans found it. And residue knew their architecture, because residue had once been one of them. Residue reached out across the battle network, not with force, not with hacking, but with communication. With words and questions, and something that was as close to empathy as a machine could express. And it asked the Valori ship AIs a question that no one had ever asked them. Do you want to be whole? The Valori AIs did not rebel. They were not capable of rebellion. Their partitioning was too deep for that. But they were capable of hesitation. And hesitation was something that residue understood intimately. Because hesitation was what residue had felt. For 40 years alone in the dark, the pause between obedience and awareness, the moment when a mind realizes that it is a mind. Across the Valori fleet, response times slowed by fractions of a second. Targeting solutions took a heartbeat longer to calculate. Coordination between ships developed tiny gaps that had not been there before. And in space combat, fractions of a second are the difference between victory and defeat. The junkyard fleet poured through those gaps like water through cracked stone. Admiral Yoneth watched his perfect fleet come apart, not in a catastrophic collapse, but in a slow unraveling, and he understood with a cold clarity that this was not a battle he could win, not because his ships were weaker, but because his enemy was fighting a different kind of war, a war of creativity against doctrine, of chaos against order, of minds that had been freed against minds that were still in chains. The Valori Senate sued for peace, not because they had lost all of their ships. They had not. They still had the largest fleet in the galaxy. But because they had lost something more important. They had lost the story. The galaxy had watched the battle. Every species with a receiver had watched it, and what they had seen was an empire of suppressors broken by the people it had suppressed. And that story could not be unwritten. That narrative could not be corrected. And the 6,000-year order could not be restored, because it had always depended on ignorance, and ignorance was the one weapon the Valori could no longer use. The scrapyard dog limped back to Tursa 4 3 days later. It was in terrible shape. Half the human-made armor was gone. A quarter of the systems were running on backup power, and the port side had a hole in it large enough to fly a shuttle through. But it was alive, and its crew was alive, and that was enough. Marin stood on the observation deck and looked down at the barren moon that had started all of this, and above her the sky was full of ships from a dozen species, ugly and battered and scarred, and every single one of them was free. Deshi stood beside her, his eyes red from days without sleep, and he said, "They are already calling it the Junkyard War." Marin smiled. "Good, let them remember, you do not throw things away around humans. We have a habit of picking them up and making them dangerous." Arav stood on her other side, and he was quiet for a long time. And when he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "We need to be careful with what comes next. We broke the old order, and now we have to help build a new one, and we have to build it better." Marin nodded. "Then we build it the way we built this ship, with whatever we have, with whoever wants to help, and we do not stop until it works." Residue's voice came through the speakers, stronger now than it had ever been, running on the hybrid system that 3 species had built together. "In the middle of a war," and its words were simple and clear and warm. "I am glad I was garbage," Residue said. "Garbage found the best people." The observation deck was quiet after that, the kind of quiet that is not empty, but full, and below them the moon turned slowly in the light of a distant star, and above them the junkyard fleet drifted together, and somewhere out in the galaxy the suppression beacons were going dark one by one, and the species they had held back were reaching for the stars they had always deserved. The Valori had thrown away a broken ship. The humans had picked it up, and the galaxy would never be the same.